Here is Van Dieman's Rhubarb Crumble. This is a deep, dusty red that I have just no love for. The writing sample is just little bit lighter than the swatch, but I don't care about that, and you likely won't either. The tone does shift on the page as the paper changes, and it does shade, but this is an aggressive ink. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, the aggression shows, but the aggressive nature of this ink even shows on the premium paper. While this is a tone of red that I don't really tend to care for, I just can't stand the constant aggressive nature of this ink. It is a really, really hard pass, so enjoy the review.
The pen for today is a Sailor Pro Gear Slim. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we get to see a very nice dusty red with no feathering, no spreading, very nice shading going on, really varying the colors a lot. When you look at variables on the first line, where you see it starts as a nice, fairly lighter VA, the R gets a little bit darker into the I, the AB lighten up a little bit, and the LES at the end does get a little bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding and no ghosting.
Van Dieman's makes more than just this one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Dieman's.
Here is Van Dieman's Blackened Seas. Here is Van Dieman's Eclipse. Here is Van Dieman's Morning Frost, a shimmering ink. Here is Van Dieman's Midnight Sky.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
We can see here that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has barely any shading, though you can find it a little bit. Looking at equivalent on the first line, mostly one tone, but the E and the T, both opposite ends of the word, do have a little bit of shading as it gets a little darker there. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it does get quite aggressive deep into the paper, really to the point that makes me not want to write on the back of the page for fear of messing up both sides of the notes. However, it did not bleed through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone looks just a little bit lighter than it did on the Clairfontaine, showing a little pink undertone, which is kind of interesting. Now it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade a ton, shades a little bit. Nowhere near as good as it did on the Clairfontaine. We can find words that shade kind of decent. Look at that here on the first line where the TH nice and dark. The A lightens up a little bit and the T at the end does come in quite a bit darker, where R on the second line is entirely a lighter version of this ink. We can see that there's no real tone shift because of the yellow underneath, meaning this ink is a little bit more opaque.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here the tone looks just the tiniest bit lighter than it does on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade not as well as it does on the Clairfontaine, but the shading does show through. When you take a look at show on the second line, you can see the S is a nice midtone, very dark into the H, OW much lighter. It stands out against the quad rule without any kind of problem, meaning if this is the type of paper that you prefer, this would be a good choice. Looking at the back of the page, I can see a ton of spots that the ink got very deep into the paper, really just giving us a kind of warning sign of what could happen. But I don't think these spots would stop me from writing on the back of the page. None of this bled through touching the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more red inks. Here is Blackstone Uluru Red. Here is Bookbinder's Red Spitting Cobra. Here is Califolio Ecarlet. Here is Diatramentis Red Brown. All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, also a little bit flatter, which is not uncommon when it comes to looking at this paper. In fact, incredibly common, which you saw me move quite possibly as I tend to mark where I'm at. And I'm just moving it because I do film a bunch of the writing before. No feather, no spread. It shades decent enough considering what the paper is. I'm going to say this is really good. It stands out against the quad rule. This, if you're a student using it, would be a great second color on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Dieman Registrar's Blue Black. Here is Levenger Smoky. Here is Noodler's Blue.
Here is Sailor Manyo Chigaya.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone we get is just about the same as we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, we get no feathering. We get barely any spread at all. Any spread that's really there is so minor, it's not worth paying much attention to. This makes it a very good ink in what's going on with this paper. The shading, it does shade. It's not huge. It's definitely there. You look at thing on the first line, and the H is darker than the T or the ing at the end. When you look at columns on the second line, the LU is darker than the CO or the M and S at the end. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it does get deeper into the paper in certain areas. Deeper, nowhere near the idea of bleeding. It does make me think that I would not write on the back of the page, but in many areas, it looks as if you could. Nothing bleeds through touching the page on the other side, or touching the page underneath, but it does mean that I probably am not writing on both sides.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Sailor Pro Gear Slim has a medium to dry fine nib, and simply the aggression of this ink cannot stand. Off camera, I tried this in a very dry fine to try to calm the clubber lang aggression of this ink. It left the back of the pages as bloodied and bruised as Rocky after his first fight with Mr. T. My recommendation is to put this ink into a pen of a mortal enemy that you really want to frame for murder because of all of the bleeding that's really going to go on. It is frequently going to be able to touch the page underneath. Now, the papers I use in the reviews have been chosen because they have some of the best performance that I'm finding with some inexpensive papers. Other papers, bloodbath. Just don't put this ink in my pen or we're going to have some issues.